want to welcome everyone here today. Without objection, the chair may declare a recess at any time. I now recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. Good morning. Today, the House Oversight Committee is holding its first hearing on the massive fraud in Minnesota's social services program. Minnesota's social services, which are funded by you, the American taxpayer, are being ripped off. The most vulnerable are suffering as a result. Federal prosecutors estimate that these criminals have stolen at least $9 billion. The fraudsters, many of whom are from Minnesota's Somali community, have stolen from programs meant to feed needy kids, provide services to autistic children, house low-income and disabled Americans, and provide health care to vulnerable Medicaid recipients. Fraudsters like these take millions to enrich themselves while providing nothing, overstating or outright faking the services. How many children have gone hungry because fraudsters stole money that was intended to provide them with food? How many autistic children were denied services because fraudsters instead sent this money overseas? How many low-income seniors, people with disabilities, or those with mental illnesses were denied access to housing because fraudsters drained resources and pocketed the money for themselves? The breadth and depth of this fraud is breathtaking, and I fear that this is just the tip of the iceberg. The U.S. Department of Justice is already investigating another Minnesota service program after a disabled man battling drug addiction under the care of a fraudulent full-time provider died because of neglect. Governor Tim Walz, Attorney General Keith Ellison, and Minnesota's Democrat leadership have either been asleep at the wheel or complicit in these crimes. How could they allow this massive fraud to go on for years? This is why we're here today. We must expose this theft of taxpayer dollars and hold everybody accountable who let it happen. Today, we're joined by witnesses from Minnesota State House of Representatives who have been fighting this fight for years. These legislators are on the front lines, uncovering fraud in Minnesota's social services programs day in and day out and trying to get their state agencies to fix it. Thank you all for what you're doing to uncover the truth. This isn't just a Minnesota problem. It's a problem for taxpayers across the United States. About 35% of Minnesota's budget comes from federal grants. 35% of Minnesota's budget comes from federal grants. Hardworking Americans pay those taxes, and that money is being funneled to fraudsters, funding luxury homes, fancy cars, and vacations abroad. Some of it is even allegedly going overseas to support terrorists. And yet, Governor Walz, Attorney General Ellison, and Minnesota Democrats failed to act despite countless warnings. They failed Minnesotans and all Americans, handing millions of taxpayer dollars to fraudsters. They failed children and others in Minnesota. They failed their own state employees, some of whom have come forward as whistleblowers. These whistleblowers have told us that the Walz administration retaliated against employees who warned and alerted the administration to the fraud occurring within these social services programs. Again, Governor Walz accused employees who were simply doing their jobs of racism, Islamophobia, and threatened surveillance to silence them. President Trump and his administration are taking a whole-of-government approach and prosecuting these fraudsters. To date, the U.S. Department of Justice has charged 98 defendants in Minnesota fraud-related cases, 85 of whom are of Somali descent. 64 have already been convicted. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security is on the ground conducting investigations of suspected fraud sites in Minnesota. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services has frozen child care payments and started requiring documentation to prove entities are indeed providing child care. Other federal agencies are halting grant programs, investigating public housing fraud, and strengthening program eligibility requirements. The American people demand jail time for those who stole their hard-earned money and accountability for officials who sat by as resources were drained. Congress must ensure there is change and accountability so this does not happen again. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today. Americans, thank you all for exposing this critical issue. And with that, I yield to Ranking Member Garcia for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Comer. I just want to start by thanking, of course, our witnesses for being here today and for all the members being back. We all agree, I think everyone on both sides of the aisle can agree, that fraud is a threat at every level of government, in every private sector business, and to every single American. Fraud exists everywhere. When I was mayor of my hometown in Long Beach, we worked for better and more efficient government and took on fraud whenever it existed and wherever it appeared to protect taxpayers. It's something that all of us take seriously every single day. When we find fraud, we should punish people and those that are committing it against the American public, especially when it damages services that people rely on. Now, what we should not do is use fraud as an excuse to rip away aid from innocent people who follow the rules and need help in our society. We should fight fraud when people rip off programs designed to help working families. And also, we should fight fraud when large corporations and wealthy individuals dodge their own taxes and rig the system for their own benefit. And especially, we should fight fraud when figures in our government, particularly those in power within the White House or our agencies, get rich and profit from their offices. Fraud is never acceptable, and it undermines public trust, whoever commits it. But let's remember that some of the worst fraud and corruption is actually found at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Republicans like to talk about fraud in states with Democratic governors, oftentimes exclusively. But Republicans also have a president who has pardoned or reduced jail time for 25 criminals convicted of fraud in this year alone. Now, some of these fraudsters have made also huge campaign contributions to Donald Trump. And worst of all, Trump's pardons mean that these criminals can avoid paying back more than $1 billion, which they owe their victims, and dwarfs much of the fraud that the House majority wants to talk about today. This is actually the opposite of accountability. Instead, the House majority wants to excuse and cut programs, which they have done from the start. Now, Donald Trump's signature law cut money for health care and food programs. Medicaid and CHIP help almost half the kids in the United States see a doctor. And that we lost, of course, $1 trillion in those programs. Over 10 million people could lose health care. Trump's law also cut 40 million people who use SNAP. And this includes, by the way, 1 out of every 5 kids. And this is happening not just in Minnesota. The president plans to freeze more than $10 billion for child care subsidies, social services, and cash support for low-income families in Minnesota, New York, Colorado, Illinois, and my home state of California. Of course, we know these states have Democratic governors that Donald Trump wants to punish. And we should look at those consequences if we want to talk about fraud.